Now we shift to Germany in the early 1920s and enter a different reality. Here, paper money lost all meaning. A loaf of bread cost 100 marks at first. A week later, 1,000. In a month, 1,000,000. By the end, 100 billion. People carried money in wheelbarrows. Children played with stacks of banknotes as building blocks. Firewood cost more than currency, so people burned bills to heat their homes. Imagine this. You're paid twice a day, morning and afternoon, just so you can rush to the store before your wages lose even more value by evening. Restaurant waiters sprint between tables, updating prices during lunch as inflation rises mid-meal. Retirees who had saved their entire lives now beg for soup and bread lines. But behind this surreal absurdity stood more than reckless policies. This was a story of defeat, humiliation, international greed, political intrigues, betrayals, and fatal decisions that turned Weimar Germany into an economic wasteland, and ultimately opened the door for the most monstrous force of the 20th century. What pushed Germany into this abyss? Who betrayed the nation for personal gain? And could it have been stopped, but wasn't? Today, we pull back the curtain on one of modern history's darkest economic tragedies. Catastrophes rarely strike suddenly. They grow gradually, like a spreading illness. And Weimar's hyperinflation was exactly that, a poison that began flowing through Germany's veins long before the first banknote, with endless zeros, rolled off the printing presses. It began in 1918. World War I ended with the humiliating surrender of the German Empire. The Hohenzollern monarchy collapsed. Kaiser Wilhelm II fled into exile. The country was left with wounded soldiers, widows, cripples, demoralized veterans, and bankrupt citizens. But the worst was yet to come. In 1919, in Versailles, the victors, France, Great Britain, the United States, and their allies, imposed a crushing peace settlement on Germany. The Treaty of Versailles dictated Germany must accept full responsibility for the war. It must pay massive reparations, over 132 billion gold marks, about 33 billion US dollars at the time. It lost territories, colonies, and parts of its industrial base. Its military was reduced to a token force, while Allied troops occupied the Rhineland. For the German nation, this was not simply financial pressure, it was national humiliation. Many saw Versailles as a stab in the back, a betrayal by their own politicians who had signed both the surrender and this document of shame. Economically, it was a trap with no exit. The reparations weighed heavily on the state budget, paralyzing the currency and crippling industrial recovery. Germany couldn't export enough goods to cover its debts, and borrowing abroad was largely blocked. At home, political chaos only deepened the crisis. The Weimar Republic was born out of disorder, where communists and monarchists regularly tried to seize power. Coups and uprisings became almost routine. Political stability was fragile, economic stability an illusion. The government found itself trapped in a vicious cycle. To pay reparations, it needed money. To get money, it printed more. The more it printed, the faster the mark lost value. The weaker the mark, the harder it became to meet obligations. And so, downward, in a spiraling collapse. The Treaty of Versailles not only failed to stabilize Europe, it laid the foundation for future disasters. It turned Germany into a powder keg with a lit fuse. And far worse decisions were still to come. In every great economic catastrophe, there comes a moment when a government faces a choice: painful reforms or the easy solution: print more money. Weimar Germany chose the easy way and turned the printing presses into a national engine of destruction. At first, printing money seemed almost harmless. The country needed funds for post-war reconstruction, social programs, support for veterans, and most of all, to pay the crushing reparations that sat on the budget like a concrete slab. The government borrowed from its own central bank. This was called temporary issuance, but temporary quickly became permanent. By 1920, inflation began accelerating. Before the war, one U.S. dollar equaled around 4 marks. By 1921, it was already over 60 marks to the dollar. Still, this was not yet a catastrophe. Minor officials reassured the public this is a natural process of adjustment. Behind the scenes, however, a much darker game was unfolding. Some officials and bankers fully understood the weaker the mark, the easier it was to export goods. Exports grew, foreign currency flowed in, and businessmen grew rich. Certain industrialists even lobbied for further devaluation, since it temporarily boosted their profits. Several German banks began openly speculating on the currency, buying foreign currency, transferring assets abroad, and making enormous profits from exchange fluctuations. For the financial elite, inflation became a new source of wealth. Meanwhile, officials in Berlin tried to convince the public that devaluation was helping to ease the burden of reparations. If the mark fell, then debts denominated in marks shrank. But this trick only worked up to a point. Corruption flourished. Bureaucrats accepted bribes for access to credit, currency operations, and government contracts. Many elites quietly transferred their wealth to Switzerland, Holland, or the U.S., fully aware they were fueling the disaster they would later escape. For the middle class, the situation looked far grimmer. They were losing their savings, their wages were devalued, purchasing power shrank every month. People who had spent years saving for a home, a car, or retirement watched their wealth melt away like ice under the sun. Particularly cynical were certain major industrialists who began buying up the property of ruined citizens for pennies, acquiring businesses, real estate, and land. A new class of inflation barons emerged, those who grew rich off the public's collective poverty. The government found it increasingly impossible to stop the avalanche. Each new round of printing was needed to cover growing budget deficits. The central bank, the Reichsbank, essentially became a printing factory, its presses running around the clock. By mid-1922, inflation was already out of control, but the worst was yet to come. Ahead lay the Ruhr crisis, the moment that would drive hyperinflation to apocalyptic levels. By 1922, inflation was painful, but still somewhat contained. But 1923 would become the year of complete collapse, and the trigger was yet another national humiliation, the occupation of the Ruhr. Weimar Germany was struggling to keep up with its reparation payments, partly due to real financial shortages, partly due to political calculations. Some German politicians intentionally delayed payments, hoping the Allies would revise the terms. But France and Belgium decided to respond with force. In January 1923, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr region, Germany's industrial heartland of coal mines, steel plants, and machine factories. This was their way of collecting debts in kind, taking goods instead of waiting for money. The German government responded with a policy of passive resistance. Workers were called upon to strike and refused to work for the occupiers. Factories shut down, transportation ground to a halt, and production was sabotaged. The Ruhr came to a standstill, and so began the next suicidal phase of economic policy. To support the striking workers, paying wages, covering losses, the government once again unleashed the printing presses. The presses ran day and night. The money supply exploded exponentially. The mark collapsed into freefall. In January 1923, one U.S. dollar bought 18,000 marks. By August, 4.6 million marks per dollar. But this was only the beginning. A new class of profiteers thrived amid the chaos. Currency speculators flipped dollars and Swiss francs for outrageous profits. Officials took kickbacks for distributing subsidies to strikers. Smugglers moved scarce goods across borders. A new despised class emerged, known as Rubermacher, those who moved their capital abroad. The elites, bankers, industrialists, politicians quietly transferred assets into foreign currency, buying real estate in Switzerland, France, and the Netherlands. They knew full well the system was on the brink of collapse. Among ordinary people, anger and despair spread like wildfire. The Ruhr crisis bundled every pain of Weimar into one tangled mess: economic collapse, political weakness, international humiliation, and internal betrayal by the elites. Radical movements flourished in the chaos: far-right paramilitary groups, the Freikorps, communist militias, and new political adventurers who promised to end Weimar's shame. As billions of marks poured off the printing presses, society wasn't merely losing its currency, it was losing its faith in the very state itself. What lay ahead was no longer simply inflation. What lay ahead was hyperinflation, that terrifying moment when even numbers cease to have meaning. The year 1923 entered German history as the year when the very concept of money lost its meaning. This was no longer simply economic collapse. It was a waking nightmare where logic no longer applied. By late 1923, the U.S. dollar was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. $1, 4 trillion. The numbers grew so large that accounting books couldn't fit the zeros, and printing presses couldn't keep up with the need to produce new notes with ever higher denominations. People went shopping with baskets, suitcases, and even baby carriages filled with paper money. Prices changed multiple times a day. Workers were paid twice daily so they could rush to stores before their wages lost even more value by nightfall. In restaurants, waiters ran between tables, rewriting menus in real time as inflation surged mid-meal. Lifelong savings vanished within days. The absurdity reached grotesque proportions. Women burned banknotes in stoves because firewood was more expensive. Children played with stacks of bills like toy blocks. Newspapers left blank spaces on their pages to insert updated prices at the time of sale. Crime skyrocketed. Gangs robbed stores, warehouses, and currency exchanges. A black market flourished, trading in gold, jewelry, foreign currency, and basic necessities. The older generations, pensioners, clerks, artisans, were utterly destroyed. People who had saved for retirement stood in bread lines begging for soup. Many families turned to suicide, unable to bear the humiliation and despair. Here is just one story among thousands of such tragedies. The Bauer family from Dresden. The father, Karl, worked as an accountant at a textile factory. The mother, Anna, was a music teacher. Before the war, they had saved enough for a modest apartment, a small country house, and a modest pension fund in the bank. Life seemed secure, but by mid-1923, all their savings had become worthless paper. Their apartment was sold at auction for what once would have barely covered the cost of a single good meal. Karl lost his job. Anna lost her students. Their daughter Gertrude was forced to drop out of school. By late 1923, the Bauers, like thousands of others, stood in line at a charity kitchen run by the local church. All they had left were 2 suitcases of clothing and an old piano, which they eventually sold for a few loaves of bread. In December 1923, Karl Bauer committed suicide. He could no longer bear the shame and helplessness. Anna and her daughter had to move in with relatives in the countryside. Their story was just one among tens of thousands like it. Particularly cynical were the profiteers who thrived in the chaos, buying up property, businesses, antiques. On the ruins of the old middle class, new kings of hyperinflation arose. Society was seething with growing rage. Accusations of betraying the nation were heard more and more frequently. At the center of this growing hatred stood financial speculators, bankers, segments of the Jewish community, and the liberal politicians of Weimar. Radical parties, both left and right, fed on this hatred like gasoline. The government was losing not only control over the economy, it was losing control over people's minds. The state no longer symbolized protection. It now stood for humiliation, weakness, and shame. The entire society stood at the edge of madness, and ahead, the climax of this catastrophe still awaited. In every society, the middle class is its foundation. Doctors and teachers, small business owners and clerks, engineers, farmers, lawyers, artisans, people who spend years building stable lives and creating futures for their children. But in Weimar Germany, they became the primary victims of hyperinflation. The poor had always lived on the edge of survival, and the rich had resources to shield themselves. But the middle class was trapped with no escape. Their savings evaporated daily, while wages failed to keep up with the exploding inflation. A familiar pattern unfolded. The craftsman who had saved for retirement. The teacher who had purchased a pension policy. The engineer who had saved for his children's education. All of it vanished before their eyes. What had been a month's salary in the morning was barely pocket change by evening. People sold their furniture, jewelry, paintings, family heirlooms, just to afford a few more days of food. But the most devastating blow was the humiliation. People who once lived with dignity now stood in line for soup, while their children walked barefoot to school. For thousands of men, the only way to feed their families was to accept degrading work, carrying loads, working night shifts, laboring as day laborers. For many women, it even meant prostitution. Meanwhile, a new caste of profiteers flourished. The kings of hyperinflation enriched themselves by buying up properties, businesses, and speculating on foreign currency. Their villas, cars, and lavish parties became objects of hatred for millions of ruined Germans. Inequality wasn't simply sharp. It was obscene. Society split into 2 castes, those who grew rich in the chaos and those destroyed by it. And it was in this social hell that new radical political movements began to bloom. This explosive mixture of resentment, poverty, and hatred became fuel for nationalists, anti-Semites, communists, and far-right fanatics. Hundreds of thousands of Germans searched for someone to blame. Weimar politicians, bankers, Jews, the Allies, traitors within. Despair bred a thirst for vengeance. In the streets, angry voices shouted, "We have lost everything. We trust no one anymore." It was then that new faces began to emerge. Charismatic demagogues who promised to restore Germany's dignity. They vowed to cleanse the nation of parasites, to punish those who had stolen the people's future. Very soon, the world would know their names. Hyperinflation broke more than wallets. It broke the moral backbone of a nation. By the fall of 1923, even in Berlin it became clear the country was standing on the edge of an abyss, one step away from uncontrollable chaos, famine, and civil war. The old methods no longer worked. What was needed was radical, almost surgical intervention to save what remained of the economy. In November 1923, Hans Luther was appointed finance minister, but the true architect of the rescue operation became Hjalmar Schacht, who would later become one of the most influential economic manipulators of the Third Reich. Under Schacht's leadership, Germany carried out one of the boldest experiments in monetary history, the introduction of a new currency, the Rentenmark. What did they do? 1. The old Reichsmark, now utterly worthless, was essentially declared dead. 2. The exchange rate was set. 1 Rentenmark, Taras 1 trillion, 1,000 old marks. 3. The new currency was not backed by gold, which Germany scarcely possessed, but instead by the nation's future income, land, real estate, and industrial assets. 4. Money printing was essentially frozen. New emissions were issued only under real economic guarantees. 5. The government slashed state spending, and the tax system was partially reformed to collect real revenues. At the same time, crucial political agreements were reached with the Allies, with support from the United States and the new government under Gustav Stresemann. The situation with reparations began to stabilize. The new currency was issued starting November 15, 1923. By December, the exchange rate stabilized. $1 was worth 4.2 Rentenmarks. Finally, after years of chaos, stability returned. For comparison, just months earlier, $1 had been worth over 4 trillion old marks. Between September and November 1923 alone, over 500 quadrillion marks, yes, quadrillion, 1 followed by 15 zeros, were printed and circulated. Schacht understood that the key was not simply mathematical calculation, but restoring public confidence in money itself. And he succeeded. A population exhausted by disaster overwhelmingly accepted the Rentenmark. However, the reform could not heal all wounds. Millions of people permanently lost their savings. The social scars remained deep. Public trust in the financial system was shattered. Political instability was far from over. The reform stopped hyperinflation, but the demons it had unleashed remained. Hyperinflation had been stopped, but at a terrible price. In truth, the system was saved, not the people. The social fabric of Germany remained torn apart. In just a few months of disaster, Germany lost its most precious asset, the people's trust. Trust in their state, their government, their politicians, their financial institutions, and most fatally, in democracy itself. The Weimar Republic survived on paper, but in the hearts of millions It had become the Republic of Betrayal. In the public consciousness, a classic set of enemies emerged. Democratic politicians who had sold out Germany by signing the Versailles Treaty. The moneybags, currency speculators, and industrial magnates who profited from inflation. Jews, through widely spread anti-Semitic stereotypes. Foreigners, the Allied powers who plundered Germany with reparations. These images would later become the ideological core of Nazi propaganda. Social fear seeped into every home. People had witnessed how, in a single month, one could lose everything: money, housing, status, dignity. The trauma of hyperinflation became a national psychological wound, festering for years, waiting for a spark. At this moment, new forces emerged. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, still small but increasingly loud, skillfully exploited the fears, grievances, and anger of the German people. A young war veteran, Adolf Hitler, charismatic, aggressive, and a brilliant orator, quickly began gathering around him the disillusioned, humiliated, and embittered. His speeches in Munich beer halls drew larger and larger crowds. His rhetoric was brutally simple. We are poor because we were robbed. We have been betrayed by politicians, Jews, Marxists, and foreigners. We will become a great nation again when we rid ourselves of the parasites. In 1923, at the peak of hyperinflation, Hitler even attempted a coup, the infamous beer hall putsch in Munich. The rebellion failed, and Hitler was imprisoned. But this episode made him a national figure. Meanwhile, major industrialists, bankers, and military circles began to view the far right with increasing interest. The democratic government appeared weak, ineffective, unable to control the crowds or the economy. They longed for a strong hand, order, and the restoration of state authority. The betrayal of the elites became the final ingredient in the coming catastrophe. Parts of big business financed the radicals, hoping to benefit from an authoritarian regime that would crush strikes, unions, and opposition, and restore stability. Soon, these investments would bear their fatal fruit. The hyperinflation of 1923 was not just an economic tragedy. It was the incubator of Nazism, its legacy, a scar that would forever alter the fate of Germany, Europe, and the entire world. The Weimar hyperinflation was more than just a collapse of currency. It was a laboratory of what happens when trust itself breaks, when a society loses faith in stability, in fairness, in its government, and in its very future. The true lesson of Weimar lies not in the countless zeros that once filled its currency notes. Its meaning lies in how easily an economic crisis can become a moral and political disaster. We have seen how reparations and defeat in war became a financial noose, how the government, seeking easy answers, unleashed the printing presses, how elites betrayed their people, moving capital abroad and profiting from chaos, how the broken middle class became prey to ideologies of hatred. The tragedy of Weimar stands as living proof that money is not just paper. It is belief. It is a collective psychological contract between people, government, and the future. And when that contract breaks, no currency in the world can stop the collapse that follows. This is why Weimar remains a terrifying reminder even in the 21st century. No society is immune from repeating the old mistakes. Dear friends, Thank you for listening to this story of Weimar hyperinflation, a drama of money, betrayal, and human nature. If you enjoy our deep dives into history, make sure to subscribe to our channel, and please leave a comment telling us where you're listening from and what time it is. We love seeing our community from every corner of the world.